This is Real Talk, the customer insights show with Jenn Vogel, a top-rated live stream and podcast in the market research and insights industry. We stream live on LinkedIn, Twitter, and YouTube, and you can listen on all major podcast channels. Join Jenn and her guests for a weekly discussion around topics that will help you understand your customers better. Real Talk is presented to you by VoxPopMe, the leader in video research and ranked number 1 in qualitative research by Grit 2 years running. Here's today's conversation.
Hello, insights professionals, marketers, and everyone who wants to understand their customers better. I'm Jenn Vogel, and today I want to talk about how to bring consumer voices into the company to make your research more memorable. I'm joined today by Elena Lyrintzis, Marketing and Culture Insights Lead for Devices and Services at Google, to dive into the subject. Welcome to the show, Elena.
Thanks so much, Jen. It's great to be here.
Really great to have you on today. I'm so excited to have that. Elena has been a customer of VoxPopMe for a long time and was recently a finalist for the Video Awards, very coveted awards. So excited to have you on today. Let's kick things off. To get us started, I'd love to hear a little about your role, your experience overall in the insights field, and also your role at Google.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thanks for having me, first of all, and love being the VIDI finalist for Lifetime Achievement. Really appreciate that. So just a little bit about myself. I've been studying human behavior for about a decade now. So started off really during my PhD in social psychology, which really gave me that foundational theory and that research lens to start to make sense of some of just the wildly irrational things that we do as people. From there, I moved into the public health space, briefly working on nationwide smoking prevention campaigns before moving really into the marketing world and learning the ins and outs of consumer behavior. I've done this across categories from banks to restaurants to pet stores, and then finally landed in tech. I've been at Google for about 3 years, working in the devices and services team. So this is really to help understand the consumer, both to build the products and to market the products. And the products that I oversee are things like phones, cameras, our speakers, so all that good stuff.
That's really interesting. I want to know, like, what kind of irrational human behavior you studied in your was it in your PhD, you said?
Yeah, I mean, I would say the study of consumers in general is studying irrational human behavior. But I, for my PhD, I was studying moral dilemmas. So moral decision making and really how to create the most effective messaging for nonprofit advertising. So, whether you are using an emotional message, so it's a really kind of a heartwarming story, or a more rational message if you're looking for donations or things like that. So could definitely talk about that for this entire podcast. But yeah, I'd say humans are always irrational is my perspective. And so we always have to get into those research methods to start to crack the code and understand what they're really thinking.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, there's a whole school of thought that that we as people, we make purchase decisions based on emotion, and then we justify those decisions later, which is 100% true for me. Like, I make a ton of impulse purchases. They are not rational in any way. I have things in my home that I'm like, why did I ever buy that? It was definitely like the middle of the night, like Instagram or whatever, that irrational decision making. It's difficult to like actually unpack that and try to put together like a purchase journey or something for a piece of technology when we're not actually using any rational thought to make that decision.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think the emotions and kind of that rational thought interplay at different points, right? So maybe that purchase you made at midnight served a really important emotional need, but you probably still looked at the right price. So I think that there is that interplay, which makes it all the more interesting.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. And so you, in your role, you work on a lot of trend reports and the devices you mentioned, cameras, phones, things like that. Tell me a little bit about what this area of kind of trend reporting entails.
Yeah, absolutely. I kind of landed in this area because I really like that it's both, I'd say, an art and a science. So it's finding those signals today to try to predict a future world, which obviously comes with its challenges. But I think just to start baseline, I always really try to understand that the time frame that people are looking to predict. So, I mean, this is just kind of how I speak to it, but usually I call trends, looking a year or plus in the future. So, what are we trying to understand for the next year, or really much longer term, 3 to 5 years from now? And I know that may not sound like much longer term, but I think that's as far as a trend prediction I feel comfortable supporting. On the other side, though, when I say culture, I really think of predicting or sharing what consumers are thinking now in the current moment or the next 6 months. So those are sort of the two different lenses that I start with. And the work that I do covers both of this. So for trends, that's really informing our product work streams. What do we want to build for people a year, 3 years, 5 years into the future? While culture is much more about marketing. So what should we be talking to people about right now that's super hyper relevant? So I think what's really kind of happened in the past few years, obviously because of the pandemic and everything that's been going on, is the territory for culture and trends work has just become so interesting. Some of the trends predictions we made a few years ago completely shifted. And so we started keeping a much more, consistent pulse on culture. But there's still the part where, someone might be saying something or saying they feel a certain way, but it doesn't really translate fully to the behaviors that they show. So again, this is kind of like the art and science piece. And, what I will say is while there's all this kind of noise and, we're trying to figure out which signals to hold on to find that thread through the future. What does kind of always stay consistent and why I personally love this space is it's all about people's needs and people's values. So when I kind of go back to my psychology days, I think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs. At the very bottom was safety and security. We moved up a little bit in the pyramid. There was love, connection, moved up a little bit more. There was esteem, which is really about recognition, which, you could translate to productivity or work. And so looking over the last couple of years, even though it seemed like the world was upside down and how could we ever predict the future? If you went back to those needs, you could say, okay, well, the safety need, the very bottom of the pyramid, wasn't met for us. We were in a world where we really felt insecure. So we changed our behavior to fix that. We went into lockdown. We were wearing masks. We were, changing how we shopped. And then once we made that, we fulfilled that need, we moved on to, okay, now how do I connect with people while being safe? Well, that's video calling, those fun virtual happy hours we all did. So there are these theories that we can use to start to make sense of again, what seems maybe hard to predict or irrational, because it's, we all are focused on our needs and meeting those needs, and those don't really change as often.
Yeah, for sure. So I've had some other conversations with people who are specializing in foresight and trending and things like that. And I'm just blown away by the concept of it, that you can look that far into the future, and things that, like, to the the regular old human, like a pandemic was like quite blindsided me, that people that are looking at this stuff and these trends, these signals, I remember Joanna Lepore, who's from Mars and does Foresight there. She came on the show and was talking about macro signals and mega trends and this and that. Like, as you were talking about trends and culture, I was reminded of that conversation. And, that it can all be explained and it can all be kind of predicted with the right science married with that art, which I think is pretty interesting. And I wondered, there's a lot, I'm sure, a lot of signals that are pointing you in different directions or different trends. How do you decide which is the one to kind of dig in a little bit deeper, learn more about, or, pursue from a product perspective as you're, kind of planning your innovations?
Yeah, great question. And I think, I will not say that in any of the work I did, I could have ever predicted the pandemic. But when I do think about the trends work, focused on the human side of that, I'm always trying to think about which of these shifting signals would really help my product area or my marketing area, and trying to keep that long-term in mind. So I actually think, the car industry is a really, really interesting example, and just something that I've observed over the past few years where, pre-pandemic, one of the biggest topics of conversation was climate change. And, we'll come back to kind of where we are now, but the car manufacturers, this is a really long roadmap for them. They have to do a lot of research and development to sort of create these electric vehicles or hybrid vehicles. And they were doing that. I mean, we had Tesla come out before the pandemic, a lot about fuel efficiency and going electric. And so this was a longer term trend, I'm sure, that they've been tracking for a very long time. And we know that the climate is predicted to become more extreme. So this isn't going away. But then the pandemic happened, and, car sales dropped significantly because we weren't driving anywhere. People were locked down, they were at home. And so if I put on, I kind of shifting between those lenses, put on the culture hat, I'd say, okay, let's not pause our research and development for electric cars, because we'll still need this. But what can we talk about right now? Well, we in search terms showed us that road trips were spiking during 2020 in the US. So maybe we start talking about the freedom a car gives you, or, getting out on the road, finding your next adventure. The last safe space, that we really have outside of our homes. I know I felt that way, at least. We also saw people were moving to the suburbs from the city. Maybe they need cars more than ever because they didn't have a car in the city. So it sort of starts to shift on, this is a short-term change, short-term being 1 to 2 years. How can we think about how to reimagine our current product offering while continuing to invest in kind of that research and development for the longest term, so for those electric vehicles? And I use that example not just because I'm actually looking for a car right now, so it's really top of mind, but because, we're seeing these electric vehicles come out, a lot of innovation across the board. So this wasn't just one car company. It was, Ford, Audi, BMW. It's all of these car companies saying, oh yeah, we've had plans to actually go electric or go hybrid. So I found that to be kind of one of the really interesting ways that you see the same company, which, who can shift according to what's needed while keeping that long term in mind.
Yeah, I think that's so important, that distinction of trends being kind of more about product and that longer term roadmap, and culture being more about marketing. I mean, certainly, like when pandemic hit, every company, regardless of if you're a tech company or B2B or B2C, like everyone had to reposition because what people cared about changed.
Mm-hmm.
nobody could just completely come up with a new product. I mean, some people did some pretty incredible work to, I mean, alcohol companies coming out with hand sanitizer and
Yeah.
that, like, some really agile innovation came out of that. But a lot of the bigger change was around positioning. And do we understand our customers? Do we understand the people that we're serving and what they need? And maybe you needed a car to commute yesterday, but today you're not commuting anymore because your office is closed. So how can we shift that message? And it's the same car, but positioned slightly differently. So I think that's a really interesting way to explain it too, of talking about trends versus culture and kind of what's happening now versus what's happening in the future. So, I mean, a lot of these trends or, culture, the things we've talked about so far are kind of environmental or societal. But how do we uncover some of these and examine some of these trends through customer feedback? Are we, kind of learning some of this stuff from the consumer insights that we're capturing?
Yeah, I mean, I think the consumer voice is so important here, and actually that's why, even though trends and culture seem different because you're looking at different lenses, they're for different purposes, I group them together because I think a lot of the same methodologies should be used, but at the core of it is triangulation. And I think, regardless of the work we do in the insights world, always important to think about triangulating data sources, but especially for culture and trends, because you're looking at all of these different signals and trying to understand which story is mapping across each of those methodologies or each of the ways that you're kind of getting at it. So while I think the category usually, relies a lot on expert interviews, which really give that macro view of maybe the space that they're looking at. So again, climate change, you could have a policy expert that would know all of those regulations to understand what's gonna, the world in 5 years. That is extremely important for kind of that trend space. Just going through some of the other kind of traditional methodologies like behavioral data. I always think about, the census, which is very slow moving, but really, some of those demographics are great sources. So things like, we know in mature markets, the population has been aging and the fertility rate's going down. So that might mean in the 5-10 year, down the road, we're looking for more solutions for that aging population. But then when you start to get into some of these shorter term behaviors, I think is really, again, where you need to rely on those consumer voices. So while I don't recommend that you talk to consumers and say, what do you think the world's going to look like in 5 years? It is always interesting to hear those thoughts. It really is much more about talking to consumers to say, the why behind the data. So how do you feel about climate change today? How do you feel about your needs being met today, or your routines in the home shifting today? And when you talk to consumers about kind of their current mood, their current feelings, you can start to extrapolate, okay, well, if, we continue to work from home, they will likely have the same, needs. If we move back into the office or, back to travel, here's how the needs will shift. So getting that sense of the lay of the land in the current moment actually helps you start to project out what different situations could look like in the future. So again, not just kind of for that prediction, but I'd say another big way is if you do want to judge how your new innovation is going to hold up in the market or the readiness for consumers, that's a really, really important place to start. I always think about, how we switched from, the Razor phone and the BlackBerry to the iPhone, which is a totally different user experience. We were we all moved to screens for the first time, touch screens, we lost our buttons. And the amount of insights and data that I'm sure went into it to judge when the consumer was ready to make that shift. The iPod had the dial, that started us getting comfortable with using a touch screen. So I think that's another place when you're thinking about putting new innovation in the world. Are consumers ready? How do they feel about how the tech is currently working?
Mm-hmm. I was just talking to someone the other day about how much I miss my BlackBerry. Oh man, I loved that phone.
I know. It's a shame.
Yeah.
I feel like I could type with my eyes closed.
Right. Yeah. It was very efficient for working, but you're right in that innovation was so different, such a leap from where we were that I'm aging myself because I was an adult when an iPhone came out, and I'm sure a lot of people listening are like, they always had an iPhone, but I remember the first person I knew that got one.
Yeah.
And not somebody I, have a friendship with now or anything. Just I remember the first time I saw an iPhone and who got it. He was like the early adopter,
Yeah.
And because I wasn't ready for it, definitely not. I didn't get it for probably a year after that, but kind of gauging when the buyer's going to actually be ready for something new. That's super interesting. And I too, I've heard other customers say that they got these great ideas internally and kind of position them out to the market, and they don't quite get it, or it seems like maybe they're not ready, and how that, like, getting the no in that scenario is just as important, if not more important, than the yes, go ahead, because it kind of sets you up for more success in the future. But yeah. I think it's interesting about. Oh, sorry, I don't want to cut you off.
Oh, I was just going to say, and then, if the consumer isn't ready, what are some of the things you can do to get them to that place? So you're talking about your friend with the iPhone. I was thinking I had a similar experience. I remember the first person who had it, and they immediately showed me the game or app, I guess, it was the beer drinking, where when you tilted the screen, you could see the drink, and the lighter, which again was educational. It showed you how moving a screen can change what's on your phone, which was brand new technology. But I have to imagine that was not, an accident that they came out with that game, that it was actually helping educate people.
Yeah, that's such an interesting point. There's a lot of stuff. I mean, there's still stuff that I see hacks and stuff on the phone. I'm like, why don't they ever tell you that you can do that? It's so weird. But yeah, I think the other thing that's really interesting about what you're talking about is the whole idea of triangulation of data. This is $1 million question. Like, how do you merge the data sources, make sense of everything? There's so much information, but when you were describing kind of the different methodologies, like, it seems very intentional that you don't bring the consumer in unless you can't get that data somewhere else. Like, really maximizing the value of that time with the consumer. Like, yes, not behavioral data. You don't need to ask them questions about what they purchased and when they purchased it, because we probably can get that some other way. Or ask them how many children they have in their house, right? I mean, you might use that for screeners and things like that, but we've got census data. There's so much data that we don't need to ask people anymore. And that why behind it is the thing you need to ask, or that readiness to leverage a new technology. I think that's really important. Like, making sure that we're just maximizing the value of the consumer's time when we're doing any kind of insight.
Absolutely. And I love the way you frame that as, if you could get the data elsewhere, save their time, save their energy. They don't need to repeat it unless, you again want to screen or understand a specific behavior. But I think more and more in at least the last decade I've been working, I have really moved a lot more into the qualitative world, because that's where you can't replicate talking to someone and hearing your story of what, your first iPhone use or whatever it may be. You can't get that richness and those stories from behavioral data, macro patterns, and even experts who, of course, are real people, but they're thinking at the macro and kind of the trend level.
Yeah, absolutely. And so when you're bringing consumer voice into your data set in some way, shape, or form, how do you make sure you've got the right voices for whatever you're working on in that moment or whatever trend you're kind of focused on?
Yeah, I mean, another $1 million question. I think that's a super important part of the job that we have to do as insights professionals. Because I think, as we all know, if you're looking and sampling a specific population, you're going to make a recommendation that might unintentionally leave out the needs of the rest of your population. So something to be just hyper focused on when you're creating that sample structure, that quota structure. But even, besides demographics, different experiences people may have. So, I've been talking a lot about kind of the shift in the past 2 years during the pandemic and working from home and what that looked like. Obviously, I felt really connected to that because I was working from home. But, at the same time, we were seeing actually the freelance population grow. So there was a whole cohort of people who were entering a different world where you're not working from home, you're not in front of the computer, you're actually going into a place of business in the middle of the pandemic and maybe working, different types of jobs. So when we go back to kind of the idea of triangulation, we might not get that person from a survey. So they might not have the time to sit in front of the computer because they're not in front of the computer all the time. So how can we understand kind of their experience in different ways? Maybe that's behavioral, maybe that's again looking or turning towards experts or conducting a specialized survey among a population you haven't addressed. So I think it's acknowledging that and then being really, really intentional about kind of, okay, who of my population do I think I have not fully addressed the needs of or fully talked to, and using things like big macro shifts to understand, oh, maybe there is this cohort that I haven't had the chance to talk to before.
That's a really interesting point that somebody can participate in online research when they're working from home, could fit it in between meetings or during lunch or something, but out in the world the way a lot of us used to be
Right.
might not have the time or the ability to participate. And so, even coming up with that and thinking like you really have pretty quickly to get to that group of people and know that you've captured everybody that you care to represent. That's got to be really challenging.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, that's kind of one side of the coin of the right voices. I think the other side I think about all the time in innovation work is, thinking worldwide versus maybe more of a US centric way of thinking. Because if we're thinking about innovation or trends, I mean, we can really learn a lot from markets who may have a different policy or regulation or had a need much earlier than we had in the US. So maybe there are solutions that have already been discovered for things like, air pollution or online shopping, whatever it may be, keeping that global focus and making sure to emphasize, when you are thinking about a US centric trend or moment versus maybe something that's more worldwide, I think is also really important.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I'm sure there's tons we can learn as everyone kind of experiences different things at different times. I love we'll find a solution for air pollution and online shopping somewhere.
Yeah, the two biggest problems that we're facing.
Exactly. So we're going to take a quick break. Having user personas in place can really help to get to those right audiences, that segmentation. So let's hear what Vox Popme's VP of Research, Brian Monsheen, has to say about personas in this edition of Bright Ideas.
So today I'd like to talk a little bit about user personas. I've found in my experience that having a fully developed user persona in your day-to-day research can really help with keeping cross-functional teams more consumer focused. So what exactly is a user persona? Well, they come in many different styles, but essentially it's a fictional character that you create based on actual data, and it represents a consumer target that uses your product or service. So in a way, it brings your different user groups to life as if they were a person, so that you can relate better to their attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors. So you're probably thinking, okay, I'm intrigued, but how do I go about doing this? Well, I'm glad you asked. You'll want to start with some form of quant research. This could be a segmentation or other form of quant, and use that to parse out your consumers into different groups based on their demographics, behaviors, and attitudes. Once you have the segments identified, next you need to deep dive into these segments, usually using some form of qualitative research. You can do this in any number of ways. You can do focus groups, IDIs, or even asynchronous video feedback to really see them in their national environments. I really like that methodology because you tend to get very authentic responses since they're typically at home in a comfortable place where they tend to be more open and honest with their answers. So when you have your qual finished up, you'll want to start drafting the personas. And the way to do that is outline the key factors that define them, things like personality traits, brand associations, hobbies, and most importantly, what are their drivers and barriers to purchasing your product or experience? You want to keep this end deliverable really simple. Think of it as no more than a one-page template. And remember, you don't have to limit these personas to just your buyers. Wouldn't it be interesting to have one of your personas be brand defectors, those who left to go to a competitor or left the category altogether? Okay, so finally, you've got all your amazing persona output done. Now it's time to socialize it. This is the fun part. So outside of the typical presentation, you can do workshops where you get groups of stakeholders in a room and brainstorm how to better communicate to these groups or which products would be most motivating to them. You can create something like a baseball trading cards for each persona, where each one has the segment stats that you hand out to the teams that you're supporting for easy reference. Or something I've done in the past is recreate a day in the life, where we built out a real world living situation in different rooms based on our user personas, showing that what their typical day looks like. So it contained things like a planner showing their daily activities, the books they read, the music they listen to, and the brands they buy. Stakeholders were able to walk through the rooms and immerse themselves in this lifestyle, which really helps with allowing them to truly understand their consumers beyond what a PowerPoint presentation could offer. So if done right, these personas really start to become part of your company culture and your nomenclature, and it allows you to create a more useful and meaningful product or user experience. Okay, now for my life hack of the day. Have you ever struggled with trying to get the trash bag out of the garbage can because the suction is holding it back? I know I have. Well, if you have had that issue, go ahead and drill a couple holes in the bottom of the can, and it will completely remove the suction, making your garbage duties easier than ever. That's it for me. We'll see you next time.
I love his little life hacks. Although my garbage bags don't really suction into the can for me.
Yeah, me neither. But great to know for the future.
Really good tips on persona work. I'll say that. I think it's really interesting, finding creative ways to really immerse the company in who those personas are and really understanding them and finding creative ways to do that. I was like jotting down notes even with little segment. I'm like, ooh, baseball trading cards. That's a great idea,
I know. Well, I would love to go into those rooms that he mentioned. I think that's the coolest idea, to have here's the music. Maybe you have a Spotify playlist of here's what people like. I mean, that's awesome. I definitely want to do that.
For sure. I mean, all with at the core, let's understand who these people are and make sure that we can make some smart decisions about how to message them, how to sell to them, or even, like you said, which products would kind of be most beneficial for them, and really spreading that beyond marketing team, the insights team, or whoever, and throughout the business. I always love naming our personas and try to reference them when we're doing any kind of brainstorming, like, what would Ichabod think about this? And really like making them a real person, a part of the team even, and kind of bringing them to life a little bit.
Yeah, completely agree. I think the value of, as you said, bringing the consumer to life as a human being is endlessly important. This is something that we might have a deck of 100-page deck with graphs and tables and every single thing you can know about this person. But if that isn't communicated to the end user of the insights, so the person making the decisions on what to build or what to talk about, then it's, not really worth a lot. And I think, when I think about that end user, I feel like this term has been used all over the place, but this idea of stakeholder empathy, and someone who's moving to 30-minute meetings, 8 in a row, maybe they're switching between all these different decisions. It's going to be really challenging to go into a conversation with that person in a lot of charts, because you're not going to really get your point across.
Yeah, that is so true. I mean, the context shifting that has to happen when throughout the day you're bouncing around from one to the next, to the next, to the next. You really do have to, it's tough to remember it all and absorb it all. And I mean, I think that's a great transition. We had this conversation in our last episode about how to communicate the results and, how to design research with that sort of communication in mind from the start. But let's talk about that a little bit. How do you go about presenting findings in a way that's meaningful, that can actually help you to drive change, especially in an environment that you just described of 30-minute meetings back to back to back?
Yeah. I mean, I think the job we have is actually really, and the opportunity we have is really exciting, because we get to work with probably, I mean, again, biased, but the most interesting data set, which are our consumers. So of course there's, the principles of storytelling you can use, like, make sure you just have that one point that you stick to and all of your evidence ties back to that one point. But I think the bigger kind of tool we have is to really make it human. So the baseball cards, the life or the room, day in the life with the consumer, all of those are kind of based in, rigor and numbers and data, but that data is not coming to the surface. The stories are coming to the surface. So, when I think about, again, we were talking about earlier, the demographic shifts that we're going to expect. I feel like demographic shifts might be some of the most dry data that we could talk about, but the core insight under that is that, we need to build for increasingly older population. And what does that mean? Well, maybe we should talk to some people in that population and understand what the current state is our product or our services, are they working for that population? And so then you imagine a world where you're instead of just saying, hey, this is going to happen, let's build something, you're hearing from a person saying, I wish, XYZ would be built for me, because I feel like I'm completely left out of the conversation. And that provokes more of a kind of call to action, we need to solve for this, and something memorable, because again, you've named the person and you're letting them speak in their own words about something that has a ton of data to back it up.
I think that's so key, is that, like you said earlier in the show about the triangulation of data, it's not just about that one person's story or that one person's voice. It's how does whoever you use represent the data that you've already got. It's about being able to learn something new from them and validate, hey, we've got all this data. It's in all these charts and graphs that you don't want to spend 30 minutes looking at because it's a lot. But trust me, it's all here.
Yeah, Take a look if you want.
Right, exactly. Here's all the evidence, but here's the
Yes.
story that the data is telling us in the words of the consumer. I think that's so interesting and critical to kind of have both sides of it together.
Yeah, I think something else I've been thinking about recently on the fun side is how can we start to make those formats aligned with the person that we're talking about? So, my actual dream that I haven't done yet, but I hope to do soon, is to create a series of TikTok videos about the Gen Z cohort. What do they want? What do they need? What dance trends are they looking at? Because it's really putting the insights in the format of the consumer, the format that they engage with. So hopefully I'll get to live out that dream soon. But I think that those are the kind of things that, it's limitless when you think about formats. This podcast is a great example of it. It doesn't have to be a presentation.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, let me know when you get that TikTok account because I will 100% follow it. It sounds really interesting, but drawing that connection with these are actually the people we're talking about. This is the kind of medium that they prefer to communicate in, and so we're going to communicate about them in that same format. I mean, brilliant. I love it.
You gotta do it.
Yeah. Now you've said it live. Like you've got to commit to it.
Okay, I'll make a TikTok account. Yeah, this will be like a one-man show. Yeah, we'll do it.
I can't wait. I am totally following that. But yeah, I think that like coming up with creative ways to kind of socialize and it doesn't have to be anymore a black and white pie chart deck or whatever. There's so many creative ways to kind of get the message out in a way that others in the organization who maybe aren't researchers but need that level of understanding can absorb quickly and help to align all the different players and stakeholders in the company, especially, my gosh, at a company the size of Google that's got a lot of different divisions, and even I'm sure the division you're in is massive. Getting that consistent message across to so many different people, I'm sure, is a big challenge.
Absolutely. And I think you hit the nail on the head, just making it engaging, making it something, people want to click into and learn about. Because again, we do have the most interesting kind of stories to tell. So making sure that those stories aren't lost in all of the rigor and all of the data that goes behind them.
Yeah. So critical. I think that's a good place to leave it. Thank you so much for your time today. This was so fun. The time just flew by for me, by the way.
I know. This was great. No, thank you so much for having me on your show. Really love all the work that you guys do. So very, very big fan. And thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for coming on. Thanks everybody for listening and joining us today. We're going to be back later this week for another episode when I will be joined by Rachel Hesseltine of Trader Interactive. See you then.